Don't read novels, girls. You're going to whip your ovaries into a frenzy.
You are listening to The Whisper Network. I'm Katie Boland. My beloved podcast co-host, Emily Hampshire, is booked and busy on a movie set this week, so it is my turn to do this episode alone and take one for the team, which is fair because I forced Emily to do this podcast against her will. But I miss you so much, Emily, and I wish you were here. Our production team is mostly based in Toronto, where there was a really crazy story in the news recently. Toronto Public Health flagged several complaints about a gynecology clinic in the city. Basically, tools and equipment were kept in unsanitary conditions, not cleaned properly between uses, and it put a lot of patients at risk of infection. But when that news came out, several other patients came forward with complaints about how they were treated by the same doctor. Their pain and discomfort wasn't taken seriously. Their concerns were dismissed, and their privacy wasn't respected. The stories are just awful to hear about. One woman was made to undress while the door was still wide open, and then was given a painful internal exam that she had not consented to and that caused her to bleed. Another woman went in for a routine pap smear and was instead, without warning, given an invasive biopsy that she didn't consent to and that caused pain and bleeding. One of our listeners even called in with their own experience at the clinic. And this is after she had had a traumatic experience with an IUD insertion and then a subsequent miscarriage. So she had explained to the doctor that she was going into this appointment with a lot of residual trauma and anxiety.
Not only was she not sympathetic with me, she stared forward as I was speaking and typed, never making eye contact, and said, "Yep, okay, we'll book the procedure." I remember feeling like livestock to her. On the day that my IUD was finally being replaced, I was a mess. I was crying, I had a lot of anxiety, and was complaining of pain. She yelled at me, told me to get off the table and to only come back when I was going to take this seriously. To finally have a successful procedure, I had to speak to my family doctor and was prescribed anti-anxiety medication, and I've had to do this since. I really believe that if this gynecologist gave me advice before the procedure, gave me ways of coping with the anxiety, even giving me the time of day, all of, or most of, the fear that I had wrapped up in the procedure would have gone away, but unfortunately she made it all very much worse.
This is obviously an extreme and horrible case of a seriously negligent doctor, and I'm glad this was exposed and that the clinic is facing consequences instead of the usual reality of women having to whisper to each other about mistreatment. But stories like this are exactly why I wanted to make this podcast in the first place. There is an unfortunately long legacy of misogyny in medicine, of women's pain being minimized or ignored completely, of women not being listened to by medical professionals. And my guest today has written the literal book on that history. Dr. Elinor Cleghorn is a brilliant scholar who is focused on feminism and cultural history, and she is the author of Unwell Women, Misdiagnosis and Myth in a Man-Made World. This book absolutely changed my life, and I feel it is a really important read for all women, for all people. And welcome, Elinor. Thanks for talking to me today.
What an introduction. Thank you so much. And it's so lovely to be here.
So much of your book really deeply moved me, but I wanted to start with how you personally became interested in the history of misogyny in medicine.
It was a sort of two-pronged affair, the way that I became interested in this subject. Firstly, I've got a background in feminist cultural history. So it was always my impetus to kind of look backwards to understand where we are in the present. And I was focused really in my academic life at that point, just before I began sort of the research that became Unwell Women. I was focused more on art and film and the sort of histories of women involved in the kind of creative arts. And then I got pregnant for the second time. My pregnancy was really complex. And so I had some blood tests and it confirmed that I did carry these antibodies. And these antibodies are indicated to an autoimmune disease called lupus. Now, going back about 10 years before my second pregnancy, I'm suffering from joint pain, from migraines, from really inexplicable pain a lot of the time. And these symptoms would wax and wane. But every time I went to my doctor to try and get some answers about what might be going on with my health, I was told some version of, you are a hysterical woman. As a historian, part of my coming to terms with that diagnosis was to look back through my history and find unwell women like me in the annals of medicine's history. I found patients from like the kind of early 19th century who were diagnosed with lupus, who were also diagnosed after having suffered years of misdiagnosed chronic pain. And I thought, okay, medical science has progressed exponentially in a century. How is it that attitudes towards women's pain haven't progressed at all?
Yes, so many people that we talk to have created things or started writing their books or followed certain academic paths because they were so frustrated by their experiences with the medical system.
Yep.
So did you come to any conclusions about why women's pain doesn't matter and historically hasn't mattered, or why it matters so much less than men's?
I didn't come to conclusions, but I came to a greater understanding of why. And this is what I wanted Unwell Women to be. I wanted to write a book that really sort of unpicked the reasons why women's pain is so kind of systemically denied and dismissed. I wanted to know the roots because I was very, very aware at the time of my diagnosis that as a woman, I was being misdiagnosed, or I was being overlooked, or I was being kind of denied the proper care and diagnostic pathways because I'm a woman. But I wasn't aware at that time when I was first diagnosed that there was this really deeply ingrained bias against women's pain, and especially against women's articulations and expressions of their pain, their narrations of their own bodies. And that was what I began to understand the more I looked back into the history, the more I sort of traveled backwards. And that really impelled me to want to find out why. Like, where has this all come from? So I may not have come to conclusions, but I definitely have come to a greater understanding.
And is that understanding that just it was so steeped in misogyny historically, or what gave you a greater understanding of why we're told it's all in our heads?
I think going right back to the beginning of quote unquote Western medical thinking.
Mm-hmm.
So in my research, Unwell Women begins in ancient Greece, where some of the first medical tracts were laid down. And these were attributed or associated with the legendary classical physician, Hippocrates, whose name we all recognize from the Hippocratic Oath. Okay, so associated very much with the ethical principles of doing no harm, of good medical practice. And these Hippocratic texts, as they're known, became really foundational to Western medical practice. As the centuries wore on, these ideas were deeply ingrained. So in terms of pain and other symptoms all being in women's heads, I root this bias right at the beginning of medicine, where we have a strange little fable called the wandering womb. Now, the ancient Greeks believed that the womb or uterus wanted more than anything else. It hungered for pregnancy. Like, it hungered to conceive a baby, to carry a baby. That's what it wanted. And this was a kind of unconscious driver for women. And they believed that if this organ, this uterus, this womb was not doing its primary function, which was conceiving and carrying a child, that the womb would get sort of uppity and mischievous and unruly and start wandering around the body.
Yes.
Okay. Are you still with me?
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's a crazy thing. It's a ridiculous kind of medical fairy story. And we read a lot about the wandering womb. But what's so interesting about this particular theory is that it set in motion this foundational idea that women's bodies are not in their control, that we do not have conscious control over our bodies, that we're at the mercy of our reproductive biology.
Yep.
So in terms of this setting the foundation or laying the foundation for women's pain to be dismissed as all in our heads, it comes down to this idea of women being distrusted, when they say, this is what's happening inside my body. Because from the get-go in Western medicine, women's bodies have been labeled unreliable, unruly.
Yes, I mean, this makes so much sense. And I feel almost every woman has had this experience where a doctor treats you like you're just out of control or you're lying about your pain. Something that I really wanted to talk to you about is you talk a lot about being an unwell woman. So I wanted to know, like, what does that mean to you? And does it feel good to claim this as an identity, or did it feel forced upon you?
I don't get asked this as much as I would like, because calling the book Unwell Women was in some ways a kind of attempt to sort of reclaim, or an attempt at reclamation of this idea that women are just unwell. It's like, what does it mean to be like, women are not well? The women are not well.
Yes.
And it's a kind of a slur, but it was a bit like the idea of reclaiming, you know, being a hysterical woman.
Yes.
Women are just, we're all labeled unwell, at least by a patriarchal and misogynistic
by
systems of
ourselves,
power, like medicines, and often by ourselves. There is an awful lot of meaning to be found in the experience of unwellness. There is a way of seeing the world, there's a way of accessing history, there's a way of thinking about our bodies, thinking about how we care for our bodies, how we care for each other. We don't necessarily have to think about when we kind of exist in the sort of space of being well. It's when we have what we take for granted sort of taken from us that it can open up this sort of new understanding, I think, about what our bodies mean and what it means to exist in the world, in a body that can be marginalized in many different ways depending on who we are, and bodies that can have stereotypes and prejudices projected onto them. And so in a way, it's a gift. I don't want to do the whole, you know, my sickness has been a gift, but it hasn't not been. You know, there are attributes of how it's made me think and what it's given me in terms of my work and my understanding of the world that are gifts. So in terms of the identity of being an unwell woman, yeah, I think I claim it. I think that it's an identity that for so much of history has been really, you know, women have been pathologized as being unwell, as being hysterical, as being anxious, as being psychotic. You know, we're pathologized as these things. It's expected of us. So to sort of step into that identity and trace some of the history of women through that has been, yeah, it's really meaningful.
Yes, it certainly felt like a reclamation that was very powerful. Something else that I was really interested in speaking to you about is, as your book was published, and this happens, you talk about this at the very beginning of your book, you were interviewed on the BBC program Woman's Hour with a group of other women speaking about their medical experiences. And you write, and this quote really moved me, "By being given the space to speak the truth about our bodies, we were helping others feel less alone. And by voicing our pain, we were creating community." I wanted to hear your perspective on why it is so important just to talk about all of this, particularly with other women.
I think it's incredibly important. We historically, again, have been silenced. You know, women's pain, women's feelings about their bodies, women's relationship to their bodies, these have been things that we have not been allowed to speak. You know, there's an incredible amount of power in community, in speaking out and speaking up and creating that permission for others to do the same.
Yes. So speaking of ideas and questions that are confronting, one of the most confronting questions that I found you raised in your book, it's in the introduction of your book, but it's the idea of who deserves health or good health care. So what has your research found about how history has answered that question?
Yeah. I mean, we know that, you know, Western medicine has been male-dominated. So the people who wrote the texts that became, you know, medicine with a big capital M, historically they've been men, because men have been the ones who've been allowed to create sanctioned knowledge, right? Who've been allowed to go to universities, who've been allowed to do autopsies, who've been allowed to study, who've been allowed to practice, who've been allowed to publish. That doesn't mean that women haven't created medical knowledge and haven't been incredibly important in terms of the care of bodies and the healing of bodies. We know that, you know, women do the caring, the women do the healing. But it's the men who created the sanctioned knowledge. And these are men in positions of power, often in patriarchal society. Medicine's deeply culturally embedded. It always has been. It's not a separate discipline. It's not separate from who we are as people. And so it's also always absorbed and reflected certain status quos. There are biases against people who are racialized that result in things like far higher mortality and morbidity rates in Black women who give birth. There are disparities in postpartum health, in maternal health. There are disparities in the treatment of pain between, say, white women and racialized women, right? And this has been deeply embedded too. This is deeply embedded in systemic racism, in despicable opinions about who deserves not just good health, but who deserves to be cared for.
Yeah.
And many of those biases are rooted in the kind of horrible pseudo-scientific ideas that began to be laid down in the kind of 18th century about Black bodies, about the capacity to feel pain. And much of this, as we know today, was just pseudoscience that was generated as justifications for the abuses of chattel slavery. But it's something that persists today, can persist today when a woman of color goes to a doctor's to seek help for pain. For white women to go and say, I'm in pain, we risk being called hysterical or anxious, you're stressed out. But a Black woman might have to struggle to be accepted as being of her pain even existing.
You're listening to The Whisper Network. After the break, some of the weirdest things that doctors have gotten wrong about the female body throughout history.
What are some of the wildest beliefs that physicians have had about women's bodies over the years that have since, thank God, been disproven? But just off the top of your head, what are some of the wildest beliefs?
Okay, so the one that I kind of love the most is that, the ovaries could get really overexcited by women doing things like reading novels.
Yes.
So, don't read novels, girls, you're going to whip your ovaries into a frenzy, that kind of thing. I mean, it's kind of awful as well because that kind of thinking was used as justifications for removing women's ovaries. But when you read some of these sort of 19th century gynecological texts and they're talking about how, women's ovaries get, overexcited and inflamed if they go on a coach journey or ride a horse or read a novel.
Are there any widespread beliefs or practices that continue today, even though they're baseless and have been misproven?
I think the main one being that if a woman says she's in pain, the principal cause of that pain is her mind and not her body.
Yeah.
I mean, we know that that's not the case. We also know that some pain-causing diseases, for example, endometriosis, in this country, in the UK, it's around 10 years, the average time it takes from first presenting with the symptoms to actually getting a conclusive diagnosis. That's a decade of a person's life. That's not just them going to the doctors, that's their relationships, their work, their everything about who they are. That's a decade of that life is spent just chasing an answer for their pain.
So in addition to the historic horrors that you write about and that we've talked about today, your book was uplifting because there are also some pretty amazing and inspiring women in medical history that I knew nothing about before I read your book. What were some of the good stories that you learned about through history?
One of my very, very favorite figures in medical history is called Mary Putnam Jacobi. And she was a physician. She was from New York in the late 19th century. And she was one of the earliest kind of licensed registered physicians. And one of her principal missions was to disprove this idea that because women menstruate, they are incapable of work, thought, action, activity. Because at that time in history, there was this really popular belief that women only had so much energy, right? Only so much energy in their bodies. And because they needed a lot of energy for the menstruating, because they needed a lot of energy for the kind of reproductive biological stuff, that if they studied or if they tried to go to college, that would expend the energy they should be conserving for their reproductive biology and mean that they had the shriveled up ovaries, that they wouldn't be marriageable, shock horror. So Mary Putnam Jacobi, she set out to just disprove this, not with this kind of crazy rhetoric, this sort of crazy misogynistic rhetoric that was flying around at that time, but with actual research, by actually talking to women themselves.
Yes.
And having them document their feelings about their body, their kind of energy levels, their sense of how much rest they needed. And she wrote this book called The Question of Rest During Menstruation. And it won a really prestigious medical essay prize at Harvard, making her the first woman to win this particular prize. And, it's an incredible thing to do, to not just sort of demystify a myth that had been so ingrained, the connection between menstruation and women's ill health, but also their kind of incapacity as humans, right? Their ability to think straight and go to work and do things and participate in the world. But she did it with this really clear-eyed research that involved women, that involved speaking to them. She gave the participants in her study diaries so that they could document their feelings and if they had any symptoms, any pain. She innovated lots of kind of approaches to her data analysis. And, this is quite an incredible thing at a time in history when we're really embedded in these kind of hysterical female ideas.
Do you think she would be here today and feel like, okay, things have gotten better from a medical perspective? And do you feel, having done all this research that spans over centuries, do you feel like things have gotten better? And where can we look for hope?
Yeah, I have an enormous amount of hope. And another aspect of my hope comes from that, we're just not silenced anymore.
Yeah.
There's community. As we were saying earlier, there's community to be found. There are resources. There's an incredible and inspiring amount of sort of information sharing that I see on Instagram, in Instagram communities and online. So I do retain hope.
Yes. So speaking about sort of the silence and the shame, it goes back to a news story that I actually talk about in the introduction of this episode. And it's a story that's going viral in Canada, but a negligent doctor mistreated her female patients in her clinic for decades before her practices came to light. I want to ask you why you think women accept such awful conditions and how can we change our expectations and demand better treatment?
Yeah, I read the news story you're talking about, and it's just, I wish I was more surprised. It's always shocking.
Yeah.
It's incredibly shocking to read these stories. I wish I was more surprised, though, that this happens. I think women have been conditioned to be good, to accept what we are told, to not ruffle feathers. I mean, historically, again, there was a huge thing about you just don't talk back to the doctor.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember my grandma when she was alive saying you just didn't. If the doctor told you something, you didn't talk back. You didn't, snap back at a doctor or challenge often his authority.
Yes.
I know in this case, it was not a male doctor, but I think that we are so conditioned to take on that, to hold it, to hold that shame rather than to question it in the moment. It gives me pause, this question of advocating for oneself, right? It gives me, it's really important, but it also gives me a lot of pause because something I often say is that we can't girl boss our way out of a broken system. You can't just go and expect everyone to go, no, this isn't right. I need a second opinion. I'm going to call this out. This treatment's not right, because we know that what enables horrible occurrences like this to happen is there's an expectation that women will not react, that we do not push back. And that's a systemic problem. And it's not the responsibility of individual women to be bolshy, to be strong. Your ill treatment is not your fault.
Yeah. So what advice would you give to a woman who does feel like she's being dismissed or who knows something is wrong with her and no doctor is taking her seriously? Like, what recourse do you think we have?
I would say simple things that you can do, like keep a diary of your symptoms, write them down, take somebody with you that you trust, like a good friend, someone who doesn't need to speak for you in the room, but can kind of bear witness to what's happening. I know from my own experience that when I've been in difficult encounters with doctors, that I end up in a situation where I kind of don't know what's right to say or what I
Yes.
have said. There's a lot of emotion there and you can feel really belittled. Having somebody there that you trust, having like a good girlfriend, a relative, like whoever feels right for you, you can just say, no, this is what happened in that room.
Yeah.
Like a sanity check.
Totally.
Another really simple thing that I think is very important and really helps, ask the doctor to write it down.
Right.
So if, say, you were in pain and you went to see the doctor and they said, oh, I don't think this is really anything. And you say, can you write down that you didn't refer me for any further diagnostic tests? Can you write down that you told me my pain is probably nothing, right? I think asking a doctor or a healthcare professional to commit that thought to paper can change the game sometimes.
And that's so, so helpful. Before we end this interview, is there anything else that you wanted to say or wanted to talk about?
What I really want everyone to hope for is a more equitable system. But meanwhile, you're not alone and it's not your fault. I think that was my kind of main pieces of advice. And, it's really difficult, but it's there to hope for. Huge change, systemic change is what we need, and it is there to hope for. And the more conversations we have, the more resources there are, the more conversations that are had, the more people speak out, resources like this podcast, the less alone and the less isolated people will feel.
Yes. Dr. Cleghorn, thank you so much for being here with me today. And I would love for all of our listeners to read Unwell Women, Misdiagnosis and Myth in a Man-Made World, because it absolutely will open your eyes to so many things. It made me feel empowered. It made me feel sad, but it is such an important read. And thank you for writing it, but also thank you for speaking with us today.
Oh, Katie, thank you so much. And thank you for those such kind words about Unwell Women. It's been a real pleasure.
You're listening to The Whisper Network. We'll be back after the break. That conversation with Dr. Elinor Cleghorn made me think so much of a scene from Fleabag, which is one of my favorite TV shows of all time.
Women are born with pain built in. It's our physical destiny. Period pains, sore boobs, childbirth, We carry it within ourselves throughout our lives. Men don't.
That's part of an iconic monologue about female pain from Kristen Scott Thomas, and she's speaking to Phoebe Waller-Bridge's Fleabag character. And I thought so much of that scene during this interview because women do have a certain amount of pain just built into their lives. And what made me think so much about that monologue is I wondered, is there a correlation between just the amount of pain that we're used to feeling and the amount of pain that we'll accept within the medical system and the amount of pain that we will just dismiss that we're feeling because we live with pain inside of us, like our body hurts us.
One of the things that sort of struck me the hardest was her level of empathy for all women who are trying to navigate a difficult medical system. I really liked how she pushed back on the question that I asked about why are women so willing to accept such awful treatment? Because I thought she did it in like a very generous to me way. Like she corrected that the question's not really that. The question is more, why are we expected to have to correct this awful treatment when it's not our fault? So that really stuck with me because I think, and something that Emily and I talk about a lot on the show and just as friends, is like we all have sort of an internalized misogyny. And I think that exposed a blind spot that I have, that I feel like, not that it's women's jobs to do better, but I certainly feel like it's my job to do better. And it's my job to advocate for myself. But that made me look at it differently and think, no, like we're all trying, and that really shouldn't be our responsibility.
And that's our show for today. So thank you so much for listening. And as always, we would love to hear from you. Have you felt uncomfortable in a doctor's office, but you didn't feel like you could speak up? And please let us know what else you are whispering about and what you would like us to whisper about next.
Send us an email or leave a voice note at our website, thewhispernetworkpodcast.com, and follow us on Instagram, please, at The Whisper Network Podcast. If you like what you heard and you want to hear more, please leave us a rating and review on your favorite podcasting app. We're on all of them, and we will absolutely take repeat praise. We need it. Thank you. The Whisper Network is produced by Antica Productions. Our senior producer is Allison Broverman. Samantha McLean is our development producer. Laura Reguer is our executive producer. And Sydney Fior is our production manager. This episode was sound designed by Philip Wilson, with theme music by Michael Boland and Nathaniel Smith. This podcast is hosted on Acast. Emily, come back. Come back, Emily. I missed you today. See you guys next time.